welcome to Lucid Horizons. This is the sixth episode of this topic. Today we are with Professor Hassan Mansour, a professor of economics at the American Graduate School of Business and Economics. We are going to talk about some basic notions and basic concepts of economy and economic developments and how it relates to democracy and to other aspects of a society. Professor Mansour, welcome to the show.
Hello, Professor Kangarloo. I'm grateful for inviting me, and I'm at your disposal. Thank you.
I'm going to start with, as I said, with a very, very basic notion. And my first question to you is, what is meant by economic growth?
The idea is very simple. In economics, the question is, we convert things which we find in the nature and they're not directly usable to things which are usable. So in order to start the process of production, we need to get the factors of production, which are labor, capital, and land. These are to be bought and provided. These we get from a market which we call factor market. So the one who intends to produce enters into factor market with money. With money, you hire labor, you buy capital or you hire capital, you get land. Technology is included in it. So we do not count normally it as a separate factor. It is embodied in labor, it is embodied in capital and land, improved land. So the producer enters into the factor market with money and gets these factors and brings it to production process. So production is a process in which these factors are combined in a logical and ergonomical way with one another in order to produce. So it is technology governed. The process of production is governed by technology. So we get these factors, introduce it to the market. In the market, the process was there. It may take 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, depending on what we produce, or years. This process is called production process, or it is called valorization, because it deals with value. What we buy and bring into the market are the value. They're in the form of money. So regardless of whether it is capital, land, or labor, is expressed in money. So we bring them into the production process, which are factories, lands, farms, or whatever. There they are converted into the goods and services which we need. Once they're ready, a secondary market is required. This is the product market. So the factors which are bought and processed into usable and saleable goods, they are brought into the product market. In product market, they are sold. So you see in this simple story, we have two markets in the beginning, one in the beginning, which is called factor market. At the end, the other one is product market. In between, we have the process of production or valorization, during which what as a raw from the nature or other producers as raw materials, we convert them into goods and services which are demanded by consumers in the market. So once I have summarized the story into this form, then we need to have a look at these two markets. The money which enters into the factor market is called money one. The money which gets out of this process is called money two. But this assumes certain things which are not given. They're important to know. The point is, the products which are produced in this process, are they saleable? Are there demand for it? We assume that there is demand for it. We've got to make sure that there is demand for it. But once, imagine that we invested 100 units of value, money, into the factor market. If we get 100 plus 110 units of value in the product market, then we're talking about growth. Then we're talking about growth because we have put in place, our input in the market is $100, our output is $100 and say $10, then we're talking about growth. This is a simple understanding of growth. But the question is, the growth is not given, is not necessarily there. We've got to make sure there is growth. We may end up with the same amount of money that we had invested. So money one becomes equal to money two. Or money two, if it cannot be sold, can be less than what you invested. Then the producer goes bankrupt. So here comes the question of science, technology, management, knowledge to make sure that what we produce is going to fetch higher value than what we had invested. Once we get this idea of growth, which is a very basic concept, as you mentioned, then the question is, what is the source of growth? Where does it come from? Is it land which produces it? Is it labor which produces it? Is it capital? Which of these factors, or in what way the combination of these factors produces growth? Well, economists have been dealing with it for centuries, and I would not even dare enter into this field by mentioning, which can be very lengthy list. And of course, in the courses of economic growth, you may use at least one semester to teach the basics of economic growth. I'll just mention this, that once we talk about growth, the growth is an engineering concept. It is an engineering concept on which we have, like any architecture, we have mathematical models which shows the relations between factors that we put into the market and what we get out of the market. Let me mention only one example. MIT wrote an article in 1957. He tried to clarify the role of factors that we bring into the market in producing growth. He came to an astounding and shocking conclusion, which won him the Nobel Prize in 1987. What was the idea? What did he find? He found that 87%, if I don't, 83% of growth did not relate to either labor or capital or land. So growth was there, but they were not attributed to these factors of production. Where did it come then? Where did it come from then? It came from the intangible part of these factors, which are the know-how, technology, knowledge, skills in management, skills in organization, the intangible part. You know, this discovery became a great contribution to economics growth and to all policymakers, because policymakers could then decide how much of growth they want, and what factor should they invest on. Should they invest in improving land, capital, labor, or education, or technology, or management skills? So how would they try to promote the growth in their production? So put in a nutshell, on these topics, there are a great many very, very valuable books and compendiums which give us the models, the mathematical models of growth. You can name Cobb-Douglas model, Solow model, Ramsey model, models with open economies, with closed economies, and so on and so forth. So a variety of models, and it is the job, a very challenging and demanding job, of managers, of politicians of growth, to choose the right model, to apply it in their situation. And if they make a mistake in that model or application, it's a fatal mistake. So it's a very refined and fine job to understand the situation, to find the right model, to create great and good combination of these factors, and later on to achieve growth. This is a simple idea of growth that we talk about in economics.
Fantastic. And that's a very good foundation based on which we can continue our conversation about economic development and how it's promoted. So you very concisely described economic growth, and you said that there are multiple factors involved in economic growth. And just to make sure that our audience understand the difference between economic growth and development, could you say what specifically are the differences between growth and development?
Well, development is a much wider concept than growth. It has elements which do not exist in growth, but it is inevitable that it starts. Let me give you some examples, and we may discuss it later. You see, to start a process of growth, and I've been studying at least about 20 countries, the process of growth. That is not very difficult. So far as you have the funds to invest and human resources and so on, you can start the process of growth. But with every step of growth, you have quality change. Let me give you an example. For example, in 1340s, about 1960s in Iran, well, new industries were introduced and great manufacturers founded. In the beginning, we had a difficulty of adapting the labor force to the machinery, because the machinery demanded the speed, and the labor force, say for example in the tractor factory of Tabriz, the labor force, even engineers, could not work in tandem with those machines. They were always lagging behind. But they could catch up with it in a short period of about a year. After a year, there was no problem. So we started the process of growth. And growth did happen. During that period of 1960s to 1974, 1973, the country experienced a rate of growth of 11%, which is a magic number, right? But what happened during this process of growth? During a process of growth, your labor improves, skills improve, further education is required. You build the schools and send them to colleges of technology. You hire engineers, you bring people to give lectures and show them how to do. You have cooperation within the country, outside with the world, and you improve the quality of labor and so on and so forth. Even your quality of organization. All these contribute to growth. But in the meantime, the mentality of your workers change. The level of education changes. Gradually, this change spreads over. There's a spillover. Your education system necessarily, inevitably, becomes modernized. You build the schools in which your technology relates to what you produce. So relations between your colleges, your universities, and the production sites, they improve. This brings about change in the family structure. Well, the people who come to work, they come from, many of them, from extended families. But they move, they migrate into production areas. So the families they build are not extended families anymore. Husband and wife and children. So nuclear families are built. The new generation, they go to schools. Later on, they move into the areas where they can provide services. They become government employees or employees of private sector. Their families are a young man, a young lady, and children, nuclear families. The statistics show that nuclear family developed in Iran very rapidly. Once you get these nuclear families, the families with father, mother, children, you require different kind of schools and education. And of course, you develop a relation in which the status of men and women require equality, respect, mutual respect. Laws have got to change. Family laws have got to change. So you get a change in family structure. You get a change in your juridical system, your judicial system. Laws change. The laws of equality in men and women are introduced. And later on, of course, the requirement goes up and up. The same population of people, they demand more share in political say because individual rights are getting established. They demand more democracy. These are the beginnings of development. So development goes much further than growth. And this is where other factors play in. We may discuss once we come to that area that why did development fail in Iran while growth was achieved? So this is a very, very precious lesson that we have learned. And now the question is, the reason I have been investigating the question for the past 15, 16 years is to discover the areas of problem which impede the process of growth and development. We have tried this several times. Development was failed after the constitutional revolution in Iran. It didn't achieve it. Under the Reza Shah, it was not, we had some sort of growth, but development we couldn't get to. Under the second Pahlavi, we couldn't get development. We got great growth, development, but in certain stage of development, it went down. Then we came to Islamic Republic. Well, they tried to achieve some growth, even in that. I will talk at a longer extent later. Even in growth, they failed. And development was suitable for them. They wouldn't even like to have development. This is why 4 great experiments in Iran's history, and we have failed to achieve development. So development is much, to put in a nutshell, development is a much wider concept. It has dimensions which are cultural, political, juridical, while growth is only engineering and material. This is why growth is much easier to achieve than development. But the end product, which is desired, is to achieve the development, because development is what leads to free man.
Fantastic. That's a good segue to the next question that I have for you. Let me, before I ask the next question, let me reduce everything that you said into one sentence, and please correct me if I arrive at the wrong conclusion about what you just said. So, is it true to say that economic growth, the factors involved in economic growth, are not human related and governing related, system of government related, but development is really a function of the type of the type of government system, the governing system, whether you brought in the element of liberal and democracy and individual freedom that really takes economic growth and turns it into economic development. Is it true that the factor of governance determines whether growth can result into development?
It's quite true. I did not rule out the impact of political systems or management from growth. They're all important. But the difference and the dividing line between the two is that once we start growth, inevitably with every step of growth, we have some development. Skills develop, for example. The mentality of workforce develop. Right. The consciousness to time, for example, they understand how to respect time because they're working in a chain. So all these are mental changes which appear. And even the concept of time in society changes. So people learn to become more punctual because they know that time is important here and there in production sites. But after this, small, very little qualitative changes, you come to an area where a big leap is required. That is where the growth may stop, development may just break down. You may not be able to go until you address the problems which arise at that stage. Well, we have countries which have done it. And we have countries like Iran which have not succeeded in doing that. So that's a very important question. And our problem, I think, in this forum that we have is to really diagnose the problems which impede our development. If we could achieve a bit of progress in this direction, then we will be rewarded. All this talk will be rewarded. Yes, the growth is a physical and engineering concept which is measured in money. But development is a much wider concept. It has very many qualitative sides to it, and they cannot be directly, physically, and monetarily measured.
Not to really try to split hair, but maybe to the eyes and ears of a non-expert, growth and development are kind of the same thing. But you just very beautifully and elegantly distinguished these two concepts, at least in the context of economics. There's another word that's being used by economists, and it would be nice to kind of make a distinction between that and these other two words of growth and development, and that is the concept of expansion. To a non-expert, expansion and growth are kind of the same thing. Is there a difference between expansion and growth, and what's the relationship between expansion, growth, and development?
A very pointed question, Professor Kangarloo. Allow me to add one point to our discussion of development. A French economist, professor of economics, Jacques Osrui, has written a book, the title of which is very telling. The title of the book is Le Scandale du Développement. Le Scandale du Développement. The scandal of development. Why does it call development the scandal? Because it is a process of reconfiguration. You start from a status, a situation 1 or A, in order to arrive at situation B. Once at situation A, you start, there is a harmony between different elements of society. Let me be more precise in this. I've studied the past about 200 years of Iranian economy. Iranian economy, the population size from the beginning of 19th century to the end of 19th century is about 8 to 9 million. The population doesn't grow. 8, 9 million. Why? About 4 or 5% of birth rate is offset by about 4 or 5% of death rate. People give birth and people die. So population size stays. From the 20th century, the beginning, well, we had change of government and Qajar goes and Pahlavi dynasty comes and so on and so forth. Well, we have started some process of growth. With this process, simple changes happen. For example, once we get the medication DDT and spread it in our villages, the dysentery and diarrhea disappear, go down. So death rate of children goes down. In a matter of 10, 20 years, population grows from 9 million to 15 million. So population growth in about 1940s was about 15 million compared to 9 million that we had 40 years ago. But did food production also grow this much in tandem with population growth? Not necessarily, because there's longer time. Once you have this, then you get some catastrophic effects. It means that your starvation may grow. You get people who move out without jobs and so on and so forth. So this is a sort of, once we start the process of development or growth in the beginning, you have a society configured. This configuration is dismantled. You are leading towards a new configuration. So process of development is a reconfiguration of your system. And if you're not careful about these ratios and time element, you are going to end up in a no progress situation. So this is the scandal of development. Great many thinkers, philosophers, sociologists, and economists have contributed to it. And when the instances arise, I'll give some examples. Now, let me now address your question about growth and expansion. Yes, expansion it has nothing to do with growth or with development. Let me give again some examples. In 333 BC, Alexander expanded to Iran and conquered Iran and ended the Achaemenid Empire. He represented a different civilization, Hellenic civilization. It was an expansion and later on a combination of Hellenic civilization with Iranian civilization and mutual effect on one another. But did it bring about the change in mode of production and distribution? Not necessarily. So it's nothing to do with development. It's expansion of power into another area. Or second example, the Bedouin Arabs expanded into Iran again in 633 AD, and they ended Sassanid dynasty. They expanded their control and political power, and of course degraded the system of production and relations of production which existed in Iran, simply because coming from Bedouin area. They did not have even the rural relations that Iran enjoyed. That was degraded and destroyed. It took about a couple of centuries that Iran could recuperate and mix with this expansion. A third expansion which appeared was by Genghis Khan in 1219, 1221. Mongol Empire, Mongols, they invaded Iran and took over. It was an expansion. Because again, they were desert people, they took back 1-2 steps back the Iranian mode of production. They were not merchants. They were not cultivators. They were horse-riding conquerors. So the mode of production was degraded again, but expansion took place. Then we come to the story of today. Iran, during the past 40 years, the growth in economics, per capita income is reduced. So there's no growth. GDP growth is, as a mass, 70% in 42 years. But GDP per capita, per person, is reduced by 43%. It means the share of each Iranian has gone down by 43%. So there is no growth. The growth is negative. Development, no. As I mentioned before, the Islamic Republic even did not desire to have development, did not even wish to have development. They were not friendly with the concept of development. So, but Iran has expanded. Iran has expanded through its proxies into Iraq, into Yemen, into Lebanon, into Syria, and has got this sort of relations even with Venezuela and some other African countries. So expansion, yes. But does this expansion bring about growth or development? No. It may even bring about degradation. So it's a physical and political concept which neighbors with growth. Has nothing to do with development. Of course, there are controversial examples, like the British conquered India, with some controversial stories about it. Did it bring about growth? Did it bring about development? Was it an expansion? It was all together, but even a great critique of British colonialism in India, Karl Marx, he said that it was a great development for India because the mode of production in India changed, the infrastructure like railroads, they developed, and some very negative customs like the wife burning herself after the death of the husband, they disappeared because they were declared illegal. So there was some development in it. So it depends on which mode of production expands into which area and how long it's settled. So in case they affect the mode of production, there is some growth and development. But the way it takes, like say, for example, in the case of Iran and examples that we mentioned, of course, there's no growth. There is no development. Expansion is just political, and it is mongering of force from this area to the other area. So it is not an economic concept as such.
Now that we understand the notions of growth, development, and expansion, assuming that we understand it with all these explanations that you just gave us, That brings us to the next question of, in order to really implement the positive aspect of growth, development, and expansion, if there are positive aspects to all three notions, are there any institutional prerequisites for implementation of development?
Oh yes, the question can be put this way: what kind of institutions do we require to achieve development? Of course, there are. As we have seen in the areas which we didn't have the right institutions, the development that arrived at. Say, for example, you cannot achieve development under dictatorship. So the very prime motor of development is to have a nimble, clever government which has a development strategy. I would say this is the most important thing. A government, clean government. Clean, I mean non-corrupt, in order to get the sympathy of the people. A non-corrupt, nimble, and a government which abides by certain logical rules. A government which has a strategy for development means it wants deliberately to achieve the development, and it studies and has the blueprints for development. Because as I just mentioned, once you start the process of deconfiguration, things can get out of control. This is why all of those elements have got to be studied before. And you must have already plans of dealing with those. So the very first thing, to have a government which has a strategy of development. You have to have a rule of law. A rule of law, in contrast to the rule of the will of the despot or a group of people. So people know the rules of the game. People understand what is being rewarded and what will be punished. The third important element is to have the clear property rights. Property rights, without which you cannot have even growth. You can't have growth where you have plundering and confiscation and expropriation of the capital of the people who want to produce. So property rights and security of property, that's a very important condition. You need some modern institutions like banking system, the banking, because as we know, the monetary circulation is the blood of the body of economics. For that, we need a logical system of central banking and functional banking system. Well, monetary economics in itself has got numerous Nobel Prizes, so we know the delicacy of it, intricacy of it, but we've got to have people who understand and know how it functions. So the kind of things which we'll deal with perhaps later once we come to Iran, you cannot deal with these institutions as if they are playthings and you can do whatever you like with them, like banking system. No, there are very solid rules. Deviate from them and you are doomed. Then you have scientific and technological institutions, universities, growth of universities, and fields of study which are scientific and science built. Besides some examples, in my study of Singapore, where I visited universities here and there and so on and so forth, it was obvious fact I realized the investment of the government of Singapore in university was colossal. They tried to build first-class universities, so much so that any graduate from Singaporean universities, they were recognized by a great many developed countries. But what fields did they study? Did they study every field? No. Because they had limited resources, they wanted to concentrate on the fields which contribute directly to development. So, one of the major fields they studied and made doctoral degrees in it was medicine. Why medicine was so important? Because we need a healthy population to have growth and development. Second was engineering. Science of engineering, because economic growth is built in engineering, it's engineering work. Third, law. They used law graduates with doctoral degrees, and the system is law governed, because without law and clarity of rights, you cannot have a development. And four, economics, because whatever you do is governed by economics in your production. If they are not economic decisions that you make, then it is going to lead to failure. It is not the fancy work. It is work which has got to be calculated. So in these four fields of medicine, engineering, law, and economics, they produce doctoral degrees. So investment and right investments. And after you have achieved your development, of course, other fields can also be prioritized. But for achieving those goals, you need the basic things, which are the basic forces, which are the engines of development and growth. And later on, these are some of internal institutions that need to be built and strengthened. Then, of course, you need external links, external institutions. For example, your foreign policy plays a very important role. You've got to have friendly relations with advanced nations, get their help, get their advice, and get their capital, and get their expertise. Then international institutions like IMF, World Bank, OECD, and so on and so forth. They all have great pools of knowledge, pools of experience, and of course, money to help you with. So internally, you lay up and you create your own blueprints for development. Externally, you have people with whom you cooperate and get their help. So put together all these requirements internally and externally. They can help you. It's not guaranteed because there are many delicacies in the process of development that politicians have got to be very resourceful in order to deal with it. Otherwise, it will fail. Because one part of it is social and cultural. So you've got to have all sorts of expertise to deal with the process of development. But these are the basic institutions inside and outside the country in order to help it achieve the goals of development.
All right. So now we are clear on the concepts and the notions of growth, development, expansion, and prerequisites. And you kind of alluded into the internal and external players in the development process. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more on the internal and external players and give us some examples for specific countries? Like, for instance, who are the internal and external players, for instance, in the context of growth, development, and expansion for Iran in the last 4 decades, for instance? And could you compare that with another country, any country of your choice, America, China, a European country? And what is arresting development in, for instance, in Iran compared to another country that's not constantly in conflict with the rest of the world?
Well, a great many examples in the world, and well, the experience of Iran is in front of our eyes. Um, Development is a process which is law governed, which means it is regular, and there are steps which are well defined in advance. Where are we going and how are we going it? So we have blueprints for it. We even try to foresee the problems which may arise. I'll be more specific when we come to it. For example, what kind of problems may arise from the family front? What kind of problems can arise in religious front? These are the problems which arise and paralyze Iranian development, Iranian march to development. You see, it was much easier to achieve the growth of 11%, but when it required change in family structures and equality in men and women, we had a backlash of religion. That is a requirement which arises out of the process of development. You start it, then you get it. But were we prepared for it? No, we were not prepared to deal with it. When the religious backlash came, we were not prepared to deal with it. This is why the system had to succumb, to go down, which is very fatal. Now, we'll deal with that maybe more elaborately later, but let me come to this question. I mentioned some of the internal and external institutions which are required for development. The most important is a government which has the strategy of development. Well, we lost that government, that institution, with the whole of Pahlavi dynasty, which had the will of growth. We lost that. Then we had a government which was enlarged. The number of employees grew by many folds. But the functions they provide, they were reduced much, much less and degraded. Let me cite only one example. Oil industry, which produced about 6 million barrels of oil per day, had about 24,000 employees. Now it produces about 2-3 million barrels a day and has hundreds of thousands of employees, while technology has developed. You see, you have an inflation of the employed people, which are not employed to do work. Once you hear from ministers saying that we have 1,800 clergy in the oil industry, then you ask yourself, what is the function of clergy within oil industry? I, as an oil man, know no function within oil industry which can be performed by a mullah. Neither a research side, nor a production side, nor refining side, nor administration side, no. So you need a government which has a strategy, clear strategy of growth and development. That's the main thing. And later on, all other institutions underneath within your society, family structure has suffered a great change during these 40 years, 4 decades. Political structures, they've changed. A great chaos rules in the country. Foreign policy, which I mentioned as a great institution for development, foreign policy is friendly towards the world. It is always in conflict with here and there and with the majority of the countries of the world. So you lose the cooperation of all other international institutions. Take the latest example that Iran has demanded $5 billion of World Bank help, and they haven't got it yet, while they are a member of the institutions, because the relations are not good and friendly. And what kind of friendly relations do you have with any institution of development in the world? So all these institutions, internally and externally, they required goodwill between them, internal institutions, external institutions. So you can have the cooperation and goodwill of other forces, of other powers in the world in order to help you with development. You need to command international credibility and respect. And you need the capability of organizing mutual cooperative relations with them. So both internal relations, internal institutions, some of them have gone astray and they have been degraded. And externally, the relations with other institutions have been degraded and cut. So this is the dilemma that we have now with the Islamic Republic. You look at it, on the one hand, well, there are forces which are powerfully and positively growing within the country. We have a population which is very smart. We have the youth, great number of youth, in workforce, outside the workforce, unemployed about 25 to 30%. We have built universities, but what's the quality of universities? The number of Iranian students has increased dramatically, university students. But we have studied it. I was one of the members of the Swedish government who was studying it in order to evaluate Iranian degrees. We couldn't really get, I mean, they couldn't get to a point where they could say, all right, this degree is equal to this degree. In certain cases that I came across, an Iranian, say, dentist would be employed as a second year student. The only institution which was kindly respected was the Industrial University of Sharif, whose graduates was kind of comparable to other students. This story was about a couple of decades ago. But the situation is such, you look at the quality of education, the quantity has increased, but has quality developed in tandem with the world developments? Technologically, well, we know that we have good technical knowledge within Iranian universities. By scientifically, do we have scientific morale? Do we have scientific attitudes towards things? No, they do not go in the same direction. This is how the relations between internal and social relations, they are kind of corrupted and degraded and go down.
Brilliant, brilliant. Very crystal clear. So now that we know about all these notions and the relationships and the role of the players, both internal and external, and you eloquently explained the factors, ideological factors, such as the presence of mullahs in the oil industry, and the fact that you couldn't see any role for them in the process of growth, development, and expansion, and all of that, and in overall picture of the economy. What about the other notions, such as nationalism and patriotism? Do they play a part in development as motivating and mobilizing force?
Yes, of course they do. But let's make a distinction between the two concepts you mentioned, patriotism and nationalism. Well, patriotism is a historical concept, which is old. It means that, well, you can find patriotism. Patriotism is the love of land and the place and your family and the land on which you live. Even before the existence of the concept of nation, we have patriotism. Everybody loves his or her home and family and people. It also demands respect for the family, respect of their rights, even if there are conflicts, but people do respect each other because they're living in the same area under the same predominant factors. So this is what's called patriotism. But to create social cohesion, yet it does play a role. It does play a role even if the real patriotism is much limited, because the concept of nation is a modern concept which is kind of limited to a land, which is the country, and a state. While the concept of land and country under patriotism is a diffuse and fluid. It means that it is not so precise, because even the countries didn't have the boundaries. The boundary went as far as your army could go. So the boundaries of the countries were not defined. The concept of nation comes with, well, French Revolution is called. Then we have nation and state. Then we have the concept of État-nation, the government and the state and nation. Here to relate these concepts to development. Because patriotism is an old concept, it does not have necessarily links with development, because development is a product of nation and nationalism. Here we've got to add another dimension to our definition. What is development? Development is to move from a pre-capitalist mode of production to capitalist mode of production and go further. Without an example of a capitalist production, you wouldn't have development. So the concept of development did not exist. Concept of expansion did exist. In all these wars and conflicts in the world, expansion did exist, but development didn't. Development means changing a mode of production into another mode in which you have institutions like capital, markets, free exchange, freedom of man, individual, and so on and so forth. This is concomitant with concept of nation. So nationalism comes as an engine of growth and development. The countries who haven't even achieved the nationhood yet, they do have some patriotism. They do have patriotism. They are prepared to defend themselves. But the nation is a modern concept, and nationalism is the engine of growth and development. The concept has grown in Europe and later on expanded. Now we have in all the world, we have United Nations, where we have 198 countries that each represent a state which represents a nation. During the course of history in the past 2 centuries, well, we've had varieties of nationalisms and the way that they express themselves. So the concept has created great variety of nationalism. I mean, some of its outgrowth has become inimical with other nations. So nationalism has played some negative role in certain areas. You take the example of Second World War, you have the fascism, Nazism, and Mussolini's Italy, and so on and so forth. So nationalism played a role, a devastating role, and created wars. Since then, a great many new factors since the Second World War. Well, there is some reign, some control over the conflicts, some mechanisms which are adequate or inadequate to control the conflicts that have been created. Sometimes they function, sometimes they do not function. You have the Security Council, you have the United Nations, and so on and so forth. And of course, you have the nuclear weapon, which is an impediment of the new wars. But here and there, again, nationalistic eruptions have caused, like in Bosnia, in Yugoslavia, here and there, problems. So nations have learned to tame this positive force of nationalism and to stop them turning into negative forces, destructive forces. So the concept of supernations have grown. Supranationality, say for example, the concept of the United States of America, in which you have 50 states, they become federal. And you have different people, different languages, different religions, but one country. Later on, you have tried to engineer another supernation in Europe, even if defectively. We have created European Union, which is one of the greatest creations of mankind historically, one of the greatest. Some 28 now, 27 countries have become one. But have they really integrated? No. Are they really blueprints for integration? Yes, they have been, but they're not feasible. Just to mention by passing that, well, in Europe we have the integration in monetary terms that we have common market. Common market has grown into a single market, which is a great achievement. Single market of Europe, which has rules and regulations applied for all members of this great union. But do we have monetary union? Yes, we have a euro, which applies to 18 countries. But is this euro a money like dollar? No, it's not. It does not have the transmission belt. What is that? In the United States, you can tax in California and spend in Missouri. Federal government can do that. In Europe, you cannot do that. In Europe, the budget which is behind your money is about 2.5% of your national budget. So this money doesn't have the power of raising money from one area, spending in another area, investing in another area. This is what we call transmission belt. It doesn't have the transmission belt. Why can it not be built? Because of nationalism. Each nation wants to keep its sovereignty as a nation. What about fiscal integration? We've had monetary integration, but do we have fiscal integration? No. Fiscal means you unify your rules and regulations and models for taxation. It's a very complicated business. So Germany, Italy, France, they have different taxation systems. Why don't they unify? They cannot. It's not so easy. It's not practical to do that. This is why they have agreed to live the way it is, this halfway from building a super nation. What about foreign policy? Have they built one foreign minister? No. They built a representative for foreign policy in which all those 27 countries have a vote and in which all of them have a veto. It means if Europe wants to do something, say vis-a-vis Iran, and only one country like Greece says no, they cannot do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because each country has a veto right in it.
Yes. Yes.
This makes it a lame duck. This makes Europe a lame duck because the foreign ministry of United States can make a statement with full force of the federal government, while in Europe, the foreign representative foreign policy cannot do that.
Unfortunately, we have come to the end of
our... Let me go over from this...
Unfortunately, I was sorry to interrupt, but...
I'm coming to the end of the program.
end of the program. And this is a fascinating conversation that, I would like to pick it up from where we left off this time. And unfortunately, we have to leave it there. But, we are going to come back next week and follow and build up over these introductory remarks and introductory notions that you so elegantly and eloquently described for us. Thank you very much, Professor Mansour, for taking the time.
I'm grateful, Professor Kangaroo. Thank you very much indeed.
And I will see you
and thanks for the audience. Thank you very much.
And the viewers next time. Thank you.
I'm grateful.